Welcome to One Word Stories. My name is Joanna Zell, and I'm very, very happy to welcome a very special guest of mine, Richard Olivier. Richard is an artistic director at the Olivier Mythodrama, and he is very, very much interested in working with particularly archetypes that go back to Jung, of course, in the context of leadership and also leadership coaching. Richard, how did this passion start?
Well, I grew up in a theatre family. Both my parents were actors, so I grew up surrounded by the idea not just of stories as a narrative, but stories as something that can be embodied. And that by embodying a story, it becomes true in a way that simply, reading it or imagining it doesn't. So that was my background. I was a theatre director, was my first career for 15 years. And I ended up getting a little bit disillusioned with the theatre at that time. This was in like the late 1980s, early 1990s, where it seemed to be losing for me its real kind of cultural edge of being a center of education for a culture and becoming much more focused on entertainment and having a good night out. And personally, my interest was in the educational part of theatre. And I went on my own personal development search, worked with, among others, the American poet Robert Bly and the archetypal psychologist James Hillman. And they were working at that time to try and help men become more expressive. So they created something that at that time was called the mythopoetic men's movement. Mm-hmm. And it was about trying to create spaces that men would feel more willing to be vulnerable, to talk about what was really going on in their lives, and to think about transforming the story of how we hold ourselves as men in the world. And it was very much an homage to the work that had been done in the 20 years before that in feminism to revision the story of what women were and could be in the world. And this movement was then effectively about, so in response to this big shift, how do we also need to revision our place in the world? And the capacity to be more open, more vulnerable, more connecting with other human beings felt like it was a really good first step. And they were using stories, ancient fairy tales, and archetypal psychology as ways of becoming more self-aware. What is your story in the world? What story are you in? Is it working for you? What archetypes are kind of running the show, etc., etc. So that became my first, where I was very much a student of that work and studied it from the inside out. And then I came up with the notion in the kind of mid-1990s of what I called mythodrama, which was essentially working with great stories, but embodying them, dramatizing them, reflecting them into our own lives by staging parts of our lives that we could see mirrored in the story. So it was a way of activating the stories and the archetypal resonances that they held in people, not as a fiction, but as a kind of therapeutic process or as a developmental process. I've been working with different sets of characters of archetypes for 25 years. And I've explored many different sets, including some relating to the Greek gods, the Roman gods, some African gods and goddess figures, and as well as more sort of eternal Jungian archetypes. And eventually I found my current working partner, Lawrence Hillman, who works with archetypes based on the planets in our solar system. And he's what is called an archetypal cosmologist. Mm-hmm. So he looks at what's happening in the sky and makes synchronous relationships with what is happening in the world. And we took the 10 planetary archetypes and translated them with great ease, actually, into 10 leadership archetypes, which we use. And so we have 10 leadership archetypes and 5 what we call leadership realms. And I can take you through them quickly for a couple of minutes. So the 5 realms of leadership we call order, how we organize things; relationship, how we interact with other people; creativity, how we innovate; change, how we manage transitions; and action, how we get things done. And the 10 then split into 2 in each of those realms, giving you 2 kind of essentially important but crucially different styles stroke archetypes in each of the realms. So in order here, we have the sovereign, which is the part of us that organizes through vision and purpose, sense of being in the right place and knowing where we're going. And the strategist, who's much more about structure and mastery. What's the roadmap? What's the process we're going to follow? And what are the facts we need to be aware of as we do it? In relationship, we have the nurturer and the lover. The nurturer manages relationship through care and empathy, developmental impulse, the natural sort of parenting archetype, whereas the lover seeks to increase social interaction. So it's a much more equal relationship based on desire, what we want, and beauty. How do we increase the beauty in the world? In creativity, we have the dreamer and the storyteller. The dreamer is the part of us that imagines the future, that gets those first little inspirations or intuitions of what we could be or what we want to do. And the storyteller, who then has to communicate that, synthesize the threads and create a narrative that others can follow. In change, we have both the renegade and the transformer. The renegade is the inventor, the disruptor. If you think about Elon Musk, Greta Thunberg would be 2 kind of renegade characters in the public eye at the moment, who change things radically and overnight and believe in themselves and push things forward, not necessarily listening to what the normal way of doing things is. Whereas the transformer is the more shamanic approach to change, honoring the mystery, seeking regeneration, looking at the process of life and death that precedes any kind of rebirth. So the renegade is faster and the transformer slower. And then last but not least, in action, we have the warrior and the explorer. The warrior is the classic kind of martial influence, challenging inappropriate behavior in others, defending my boundaries, asserting ourselves in pursuit of goals. Whereas the explorer is more on a quest, on an adventure, a quest for truth and a quest to explore new boundaries. So the explorer will climb the nearest tall mountain because it's there, but also be reading the latest philosophy books to try and explore their own version of what is true about myself, about life, about the universe, etc. So more philosophical, action-orientated approach in the explorer. And that creates the circle of all 10. And what we've found now in the 6 years that we've been using with this, with leaders and with leadership teams and organizations, is that every leader can find themselves in this model. We're never just one. Most of us are sort of have what we call 3 leading actors or leading archetypes at any one time. And most of us all have a couple that are more offstage actors. We use the theater metaphor in everything that we do. And then, the other 5 are kind of what we think of as supporting actors. You can call on them when you need them. However, what has become very clear is that in times of rapid change, in times where we leaders have to be prepared for the unknown more and more, in our VUCA world, where everything is more volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, one set of archetypes, any one set of 3 is never going to be enough to meet every circumstance. So that actually the time is ripe for leaders to become more, to expand their repertoire, not necessarily to be able to hold and step into every archetype with great ease, although that might be Jung's individuation goal, to be able to fulfill all parts of our personality. You know, as pressured leaders, we're not going to have time for that, but we can actually learn very quickly how to recognize the archetypal energies that our situation needs, or that I need, or that my team needs, or the organization needs. So that even if I am not an expert in that archetypal energy, I can identify it and I can delegate it, or I can bring in others who can fill that archetypal need for the organization.
Thank you very much, because it gives a fantastic overview, and I'm sure right now those of people who weren't familiar with the archetypes have got a much better idea how it might work. So, you know, at the very beginning of our conversation, you said that this whole idea started in the leadership context, especially with men, so that they are encouraged to show more vulnerability. And this is also the question that I have that guides us to these huge narratives, that these huge narratives actually gave the stereotype to the men that they have to act in the order realm. So they need to be strategies, a sovereign for many centuries, that being in this relationship mode, so to say, something more or less feminine. Am I seeing it right, that it's about working with both?
Absolutely. Yeah, all of them have two shadows, actually. There's a shadow of too much. So on a bad day, the warrior becomes a bully, but there's also a shadow of too little. So on a bad day, you know, if I'm not able to activate my warrior, I may come across as insecure and submissive, you know, and become a pushover for others. So we talk about a scale for each archetype and an optimal zone where we're activating the gift before we go into too much or slip into too little. And again, the more people become aware of the model and aware of their own relationship to each archetype, the more we're able eventually to self-calibrate what is the optimal zone for this situation, this meeting, this challenge that I'm facing.
Yeah, so this is exactly what you're emphasizing right now, that in the first step, it's all about awareness. How do you work in the second step with the archetypes? When people already grab the wheel?
Then it becomes an individual coaching tool. It becomes a team coaching process. So I'll give an example. A few weeks ago, I was working in America with a CEO and a top team, and they were trying to form a new team, and they weren't quite sure. They kind of knew that there was a need for this team post-pandemic, post many challenges the business had faced, but they weren't quite sure what it was, and they really want to define the purpose of the team. So we worked for 2 days. We introduced them to the archetypes. They had an assessment tool that we've created called the Archetype Preference Report that they all took before the event. So everyone knew their kind of current strongest archetypes. And you won't be surprised to hear in a group of people in the construction industry, that was the strategist. So their leading archetype collectively out of 8 people was the strategist. The ones that they were really missing were the renegade and the dreamer. And so we talked about, are those the ones that this team needs? They decided, actually, once we explored them a bit further, that they were helpful, you know, that they wanted to be able to dream into a bigger future, and they wanted to be able to disrupt some of the old cultural habits. But actually, what the team needed, what the organization needed the team to be, was the explorer. It needed to be just ahead of the rest of the organization, scanning the landscape, looking at new ideas, new product lines, et cetera, and exploring if the culture and how the culture would need to change. And so they, fed back to us that there was an incredibly useful frame and tool for them. And they're going to carry on using it, in their meetings as they go forward, to notice if they slip back into too much strategist. And the danger is the strategist won't give the explorer time in the unknown because they want everything measurable, before we start. So they have to learn collectively to relax the strategist tendency, and then be able to move more fluently into explorer mode.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So every team and every individual has a different archetypal development need that we help them identify. So there's no, the second step is what do you need, rather than here's what we do. The first step is universal awareness. The second step is more bespoke development process. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. One of the archetypes in the creativity realm is actually the storyteller. And you say that it's all about communication, about synthesis. How can actually leaders develop the skills if the storyteller is missing?
Well, I mean, what we've done is we've created, a series of exercises and workshops, and you took part on one of the ones that we did online. Essentially, if people really are missing a skill, in our terms, they need to go into a rehearsal room. You can't get a concept and then go and apply it the next day. So we put them in a rehearsal room, and we have series of exercises and processes for each of the archetypes that are designed to get people to feel the archetype both from the outside in and from the inside out. And that's the two kind of classic ways of acting. Some actors find an extreme position externally, create a character, and then they have to move to fill it. And others start very much from what we call the inside out. Here's who I am, and I move very slowly and gradually to try and find my character. So we cater for both kind of techniques, more extreme exercises that kind of take people probably out of their current comfort zones into an exercise where they kind of have to embody the archetype. And then other exercises, conversations where people start, for instance, to recognize where they have access this archetype in other times of their life, and learn what was it about accessing that archetype that was helpful for me. Because the important thing to remember is that we all have access to all 10 inside us, but we will have preferences. Nurture and nature and the current situation will all tend to define how we show up.
Yes, actually, I'm really, really grateful that you are emphasizing it, that we have access to all of them. It's just about being aware of it. And as you say, going to the rehearsal room and experimenting, trying out and really changing the mindset. We know that the plasticity of the brain allows us to think slightly differently and also to act differently and be authentic in the process, because this is also something very important. When someone has been, so to say, trained to appear at work as a strategist all the time, as you have said in this case of the team, it's a lot about expanding the comfort zone to go to another mode, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. And recognizing, rather than saying, I don't do that, to the thing is, I haven't been doing that, but I can if I choose. Yeah.
Exactly. And especially, in the corporate world, it's not seldom that people are rewarded for acting as a sovereign, as a strategist, and not necessarily in other realms. So this is also this newest tendency also in the leadership, that people show up with the whole of humanity, as you have emphasized at the beginning of our talk, also with vulnerability. Has anything changed accordingly to your observations?
Well, the other one I'd argue that is a kind of classic strength in many businesses is the warrior. So the sovereign strategist and the warrior, you know, getting things done, winning the business, being first, being number one. The competitive edge is very strong, probably even stronger than the sovereign for a lot of the people I've worked with. But the strategist and the warrior are classically the two that get promoted. Yeah. And get rewarded by organizations who want order and action. So the other three realms, you know, relationship, creativity, and change, have been classically unrecognized in organizations. But in the 25 years since I've been in leadership development, I do see that changing. I do see the people who at least are in charge of development in organizations, the organizational development folks and human resources are becoming much more aware of the need for creativity, for relationships, and of course, increasingly for change. The strategist often struggles with change, you know, and the warrior sometimes struggles with relationships. So learning to kind of fill out the personality, I think, is becoming kind of non-negotiable skill for leaders. And a lot of people refer to it as the kind of right brain, left brain mix. More, I think it feels slightly more culturally acceptable these days than masculine and feminine. Although, you know, Jung would definitely have said it was that the union of the opposites. Yeah. Men learning to embrace their feminine side, women learning to embrace their masculine side, that would lead to a more individuated society. And I think there's some way towards that, but I think the right brain, left brain division is one that continues for a lot of people in business. The left brain kind of rational function takes control, and the right brain more intuitive function tends to only be called upon in a crisis. And if you haven't developed it and you hit a crisis, it's probably too late to start now. So the right brain leader is going to be the one who helps humanity through the huge challenges that I see ahead in the next, well, 50 years for sure, possibly a few hundred years.
So how can this kind of coaching with archetypes can be helpful for global leaders? So those leaders who work across cultures, do you see any additional aspects?
Yes, we do. I mean, we've used this now, you know, in many cultures, certainly on all 5 continents, and it is universal. So every culture recognizes these 10. They might have their own words for it or their own shades of how it would be expressed. But the archetypes themselves are universal. And what we believe that the model teaches is internal inclusivity. So, you know, if I can learn to include all the diverse parts of me, I am much more likely to appreciate and learn from all the diversity that I meet out in the world. Yeah, definitely. I love it because this is also, you know, something that is a little bit underestimated when we talk about diversity, inclusion. Many times it's so much focus on the outside world. And we need to start with ourselves. Yeah. Richard, you have just said that you've been offering this workshops on 5 different continents. Nevertheless, during the pandemics, everything moved to the virtual world. What was your biggest surprise when you moved all your offers to the digital realm? I think it was how effective experiential learning can be online. You know, and I think, you know, before the pandemic, very few people would do any of our workshops online. We could do keynotes, we could do concepts, we could do coaching, but the workshops themselves, people say, oh no, they have to be face to face. And obviously, you know, the live energy in a room is something that is irreplaceable. But what we found is that you can actually create greater intimacy online, in that instead of having people process stuff in a big group, we do much more breakouts. So people are in pairs, in trios, small groups of maybe 4 or 5, discussing things at depth, trying archetypal exercises out and sharing in quite depth with one other person. And of course, they're alone in their office or in their bedroom, and the other person is alone in theirs. So there's no one observing them. And then they get a huge amount out of it. And the other thing I think is that during lockdown, you were doing a dance class or a workout class, the kind of things you wouldn't normally do in front of a computer. And that was a great benefit to us. Yeah. Because we're wanting to do the embodied work. And the fact that people were, you know, practicing working with their bodies physically during the pandemic and the lockdown meant that they were much more free and willing to use their bodies to experience these archetypes when we got the workshops together for them online.
Yeah, during the pandemic, all of us, we have expanded our comfort zones, definitely. And, you know, it brings me to my very last question, actually. I keep posing this question to all my guests so that people, me included, get inspirations how to thrive during these tricky times. So what was one word that actually helped you during the pandemics, and what is the story behind?
Revisioning. That's the word, revisioning. And was kind of multi-leveled, really. The one was obviously the world that I was looking at was changing. And I realized that I needed to change how I was seeing the world. So seeing the world with new eyes, seeing the new world that was emerging in front of me, seeing the possibility, the fact that when we had to, we could stop a huge amount of destructive activities pretty much overnight, gave me hope that we can change some of our more destructive activities around the environment over the next 20 years. I still think it will be a huge struggle, but I think that experience will empower a lot of activists and change leaders around the world. Change can happen overnight. It doesn't want to, and a lot of people won't like it, but it is more possible. And then, you know, using the archetype way of revisioning, it is the capacity to see your story differently. You know, to look at yourself from a different perspective and see a different angle on the story. And that was the last real inspiration for me, is that we would say, you know, lots of people talk about wanting to change their story. And I've worked with the idea of change, you know, development for 25 years. And I think what I've got to the last 5 years is the clearest way of talking about how change actually happens. And it is by changing one of the leading archetypes on your stage. So if you think about any great story, if you're having trouble moving the narrative forward, you bring on a new character and the narrative changes in and of itself. And that's really the metaphor using the narrative learning theory, that a new archetype that you consciously bring on your stage will help you change your story, revision the way you see the world.
Yeah, very inspiring. Thank you very much. Richard, I wish you lots of wonderful moments, moments of satisfaction, moments of surprise, moments of connection with other people when you work with archetypes in the leadership context. And it doesn't really matter whether face-to-face or virtual. And it's so nourishing as I hear you talk about it with such passion. And I'm sure it doesn't matter if it's happening online or offline.
Thank you. Pleasure to talk to you.